Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of TU Stories. My name is Adrian Battle Marston, and today we are continuing our series in inviting you all to get a chance to know the different individuals that are within the OIIE umbrella. So joining with us today, we have another colleague, and I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brian Jara. I have been at TU for 6 years. I currently serve within OIE as the Assistant Director of Diversity Training and Educational Initiatives. Within OIE, that falls into the DEI education team, and happy to be here.
So you're coming up, I think as of yesterday, that was 6 years.
Yep.
How's it feel?
Well, I am a Baltimore Towson native, born and raised, but I spent about 20 years outside of Maryland working. So I actually have a interesting history with what was Towson State. So I went to undergrad in Baltimore City, but I did 2 summers at what was Towson State. I did a summer in high school for some preview, take a college class, and then sophomore year of undergrad, I initially started out majoring in biomedical engineering. After 2 years, was failing, was on academic probation, and so I did a summer at Towson State because it was a little bit closer to home, and it was cheaper. So I did a summer semester, and I moved back to this area in 2015. Started Towson at 2017. So it was a weird homecoming to the area, and it was initially a weird, interesting being on campus because I remembered that there were buildings that don't exist anymore. So I had to spend probably more than a year relearning the area, relearning Towson.
Yeah.
In high school, we would usually spend Friday nights, friends and I driving around Towson. So it's really interesting to see how much has changed both in Towson, the city, and at TU, the school.
So your story is a very unique one, and you've sort of been pretty open in some spaces about like your own like racial identity. How do you feel like that has sort of shaped the work that you do? And we could probably give some context if you're comfortable on what that story has sort of been like for you and your family.
Yeah, so the choice to move back home was there were a couple layers to it. I really wanted to get back to this area because that's where my immediate family is. So I spent 15 plus years at Penn State, first in grad school, then I stayed to work and teach, and then I wrapped down to West Virginia University, where I was there for 4 years. The last part of the career, I was in full-time teaching positions. I knew I had to really cast a wider net to find a job in this area because back then my teaching roles were always in departments of women's gender sexuality studies, and back then there weren't a lot of full-time teaching positions in those fields. So I had to dust off my original grad training and my original career path in student affairs, and so I spent just about a year in the job search. So I was under or unemployed. I think it almost hit a year, and I was like, I don't know what's going to give. So I actually had to really start from scratch and retooling what was my CV and made it to the resume. So that's the other context. The other piece that I can't make up is that was when Baltimore City would find themselves struggling and responding to the murder of Freddie Gray in Baltimore City.
Yeah.
So this whole path is so unintentional, but I can't imagine it not sort of leading to where I am. The murder of Freddie Gray, the Baltimore City uprisings, that really trickled north to this campus. And back then, there were a lot of mostly black students taking some serious risks to their degrees, to their bodies, and doing some real risky activism on campus. It's now sort of documented in our history as Occupy Towson, a literal movement of activism led by black students. So one of the indirect results of that was a new position to really identify a full-time person to help lead intentional diversity trainings for mostly students. So that original position is now the one that you, Adrian, have. And to imagine that there was nobody whose official job was to do the work that you and I do now. Yeah. So there's that piece. The other piece that when you do this work, you can't not keep doing your own self-reflection. So I'm in the position, and then the choice, I think we all decide how much of ourselves we want to use in the work that we do. I mentioned I spent a long time in teaching careers, and upon reflection, really had a huge awakening after a year or two at Towson, where I realized that I was spending most of my teaching career doing what I thought was really good diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice work, but I realized I'd spent probably a good 10 years doing it at the own expense of my identity, which means, and part of I'm happy to do in my work is I share that I identify as mixed race. I'm the son of a Filipino immigrant and a white woman who grew up not far from campus. And there were moments that I was realizing that how I tried to introduce lessons on race in the classroom, I used myself as the object. So I can reflect on the dozens of times where I made it a game for students to guess my identity. The other interesting piece in my own self-reflection and identity work, I was so comfortable, and I in fact played on the fact that often mixed race people are reduced to percentages. So, and I found myself, I was like, what was I thinking? And I had good intention, but it took a long time of doing the work. Like, oh, I was doing good work, but at the expense of my own visibility. So it was a really great, uncomfortable, important, ugly cry moment of, wow, look at what I was doing at my own expense. So I think one of the things you learn in doing this work a lot is you learn how to do your best work, but also not lose yourself. So I'm the youngest of four siblings, and the four of us don't even pronounce our last name the same way. So the whole story of what it means for any of us who identify as mixed races, it is, for me, the best way I can describe it is it's simultaneously always being pulled while never fitting in where you're being pulled. So a lot of reflection and work and working with others that are my own professional idols, realize, you know what, I need to stop feeling the pressure and be okay with where I am, which means I no longer identify and I reject the percentages game. It's not helpful for me. And so that's just one of my many identities. But I think if you stay in this work for any length of time, you can't not do that work. You can't not remember that you're part of the puzzle, and you cannot be tasked in your job to encourage the entire campus to do that work if you yourself aren't willing to.
Yeah. It's tough because it just kind of shows that it's just an ongoing process, for the people who we're working with and like for ourselves as well?
Um, I can tell when I'm on the job, facilitating, educating with an audience. I have this internal monologue where, and I think it happened more when I was new to the campus. I can sort of, in my thought bubble, I can tell when what they're hearing from me is useful, but I always can notice that light bulb moment where they suddenly realize, oh, I assumed you were a different racial identity than you are. And I sometimes I'm intentional about when in the entire session I will share that.
Yeah.
Even on the individual interaction, I can sort of mark it as you see the eyes and you can almost picture the light bulb. They're like, oh, it is what it is.
Yeah.
But sometimes I have been intentional about choosing when to share that as a way to take them down a path where hopefully there's a light bulb that comes up at some point.
So, I mean, it wasn't too long ago where like this department had like two, three people versus where we're at now. We've got like multiple departments within this division. You've been here for a few years, and so you've sort of seen some of that growth take place. What has that been like for you as being a part of it and also like the observer, right? You're still an employee and you're seeing the division grow at a pretty impressive rate. What's that been like?
It's been a, this may not be the best way to, but my initial reaction, it's kind of been a really good experience with Whiplash because you also want to throw COVID in the mix. So OIIE, the division that exists now, is about 6.5, 7 years old. We continue to, and this series that you're doing is a helpful piece. We continue to try to figure out the best quote unquote elevator pitch that explains it because still on this campus, you say OIE and you mean just the two teams here in the administration building, the compliance team, the DEI team. It could also be used in reference to the entire division, which includes the Center for Student Diversity and includes accessibility, disability services. So I remember having a conversation. So the original position that I was in was housed fully within the Center for Student Diversity, and that position has stayed and evolved and grown.
Yeah.
The position I'm in now initially started out as the companion to the position that you have. And I remember a year into the second position, I talked to my VP and I said, I don't understand how the work happened when there were just three people. I said, y'all had to be exhausted every day. So we now have a team of any four of us who, in any given moment, are doing the work across campus with students or faculty or staff or alumni or community partners. When COVID hit, all of us at TU, it helped for me see the investment by the university in what we do in OIE because we were able to still fill some vacancies when there was this hiring freeze. So that was the best data we could point to about how much DEI in this work is. So that was sort of a big stamp of approval that the momentum has to continue. So it also was odd because, sure, I think most of us, but I'll speak for myself, even during COVID, it felt like we were almost busier, which doesn't make sense because just as as COVID happened, we were starting to get reports around acts of bias when it comes to the virus, acts of bias when it came to masking and people who wear masks and assumptions. So it kind of makes sense that it was, in fact, busier work. I think that means that there's always an opportunity and always a priority in keeping the discussions that we have going.
So, one of the things that we're also a part of is our dialogue series that we do fairly frequent throughout each semester. Was this something that predated your employment, or was this an idea that you and collectively a group of other colleagues said, I think this is important? And if so, like, how did that, what sparked that? Was there something there that we saw the lack and you're like, we have to fill this void with something productive?
That's a great question. So what now exists as Dialogue at TU is an initiative that's jointly supported by obviously the provost and the DEI education team of OIE. Yeah, it was happening before I was here in this role. I try to describe it as this passion project. So picture like a cardboard box where it's overflowing with ideas and energy, and it was passed between volunteer to volunteer to volunteer. We have to always acknowledge that it first made its way to TU because of Dr. Krista Schmidt in our psychology department, and she is still here, and a number of folks in the Division of Student Affairs where they saw other schools. And it really is a curriculum that gives everyone additional skills on how to navigate more honest discussions around identities.
Yeah.
And it really initially was focused on finding a couple of academic courses where we can introduce the skills to students. It has exploded where we want to continue to place it in select courses and deliver the skills to everybody else. So I think 2018 it began to be attached to someone's actual job description. So it's one of the duties in my position, one of the duties in the assistant provost for diversity and inclusion position.
Yeah.
So what finally became someone's actual job. There are still a lot of volunteers who are invested and serve in an advisory role. And when the summer of 2020 happened and the murder of George Floyd, we really activated this initiative where we provided a lot of spontaneous virtual, because of COVID, spaces, affinity spaces, race alike spaces, where we tapped into our pool of certified facilitators. That led to, let's try some anti-racist book clubs. Let's just deliver everything we can using this skill. And it worked. It helped address the need. So
Yeah.
even when there isn't a current national crisis around identity and injustice, it's just useful skills for everybody at TU. It's useful training for students and student leaders. It's useful professional development for staff and faculty in any unit. And there's been continued growth in the interest of this skill set. So
Yeah.
it's going to be interesting to see how else it continues to grow. We are finally excited to be piloting a version of the staff faculty training for undergrads this semester, and we will be certain to publicize it when we're ready to schedule it.
Yeah, it's so interesting how essential some of those skill sets have been, like, for me personally. I'm like, sometimes I'll like reminisce on arguments I had with peers and I kind of cringe at the things that, like, oh, why did I say it? Or why did I say it like that? And I think about like the direction the conversations went after I sort of had my pre-dialogue techniques in conversations, you know.
I'm grinning too because I think for me, I immediately thought of my family holiday dinner table.
Yeah.
My siblings and I mean, we're pretty close in ideology, but there are a couple of outliers. So I am remembering moments at the Thanksgiving or holiday table where I'm like, see myself and like, oh, it's mostly a loving, affectionate difference of opinion. It rarely gets like vicious or uncomfortable, but it's like, oh, did you hear what you just said? So I organically dip into those skills too. Occasionally with the stranger in the cashier line who's acting out, I might choose that battle, but I do see myself using those skills at sort of the most random moments.
Yeah. So we're winding down here with our questions, but we do have one last one. What keeps you going in this work? Because I don't think people always recognize the toll that diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work can have on the people doing it day in and day out, especially when it's not always something that you can quantify your success in every metric, because you're sort of dealing with people hoping that they can experience like a paradigm shift of perspective on how they see something. And there's people that will disagree with us vehemently. There's people that don't even like the existence of this division in the way that it looks. People sort of see it as like partisan. What kind of keeps you going in this work?
That's such a good question, and I think it's important that, well, everybody, but I think it's important that folks, our colleagues who do this work, hopefully can regularly remember their why, their answer to the question. I think most of us are often describing work days as a good kind of exhaustion. For me, it's good when I can end a day seeing evidence of what we do paying off. That might be the magical light bulb or all this new awareness. It might even be still resistance, but at least people are willing to own or to be in the struggle. Because so many of us kind of frame it as we want to be prepared for some discomfort and work through it, not avoid it. So if I stop seeing that my work is making a difference, if I somehow decided I wasn't interested in that kind of active resistance that often gets hurled at us, if I suddenly was tired of having to carry that, some individuals, groups, or ideologies don't want me around. When I get tired of that, then I'm probably going to have to either pick a new path. But what keeps me in the work is absolutely being able to work with colleagues with shared values. Because if you were doing this work alone, which in a weird way I was in that first year,
Yeah.
yeah, that would have been hard. But quickly, the other reaction happened. It grew. It elevated additional positions. Full transparency. When I was in the original position, the next position was posted, and I had just been here for a year. And people were like, you don't skip out of a job after 1 year. But the work and the opportunities to do the work on a more amplified level. So I did this taboo thing and I applied for a job after 1 year here. And I remember in the interview, I said, two things are going to happen. Either I'm going to stay in the job I'm at, or I'll have a chance to do that work at a bigger level. I said, either way, I'm good. I'm excited. I said, I'm excited there'll be two people whose work this is officially part of. So I think the fact that when you know you're not alone, so the fact that this division has now grown and there's a bunch of people with shared values, that just fuels me because
Yeah.
I so appreciate being able to watch my colleagues do their version of the work. I so love watching my colleagues when they're on. I learn. It also reminds us that there's no one correct way to engage the campus in this work. So I think we're all willing to keep learning and trying new approaches, and that's exciting. So the fact that I find the whole package of the personal tax, the professional tax exciting, that's the sign that I'm still where I need to be for now.
Brian, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you all again for tuning in, and be sure to check out the descriptions on this video to find out more about our Office of Inclusion and Institutional Equity. If you have any questions, feel free to check out the email address that's included in the details as well. And if you would like to have your story being told on this podcast, please fill out the application. The link should be in the description as well. Thank you all again, and we'll see you next time.